and good afternoon. My name is Zishan Salahuddin, and I will be your host and moderator for this conversation this afternoon for the Federal Level Public Expenditure Review 2023, authored by 4 economists at the World Bank and hosted and organized by Tabadlab. There have been 3 provincial level public expenditure reports in the last 12 fiscal years, but this is the first one at the federal level. Of course, this makes sense because there were 2 events in 2010 that fundamentally altered the national fiscal infrastructure, architecture, as well as the story of the country. The first of these was the 18th Amendment that devolved powers down to the provincial level. The second was the NFC award. And because of these 2, the previous public expenditure reviews have been at the provincial level. This report also comes at a very crucial time for Pakistan, when the country is going through a historic economic downturn with record inflation, by some estimates at 47%, unless of course you quote Mr. Steve Hanke, in which case the number could be as high as 65%, a rising and unmanageable external and internal debt crisis, a staff-level agreement with the IMF that has been pending since October, despite the recent tweet by our finance minister, who just attended the spring meeting with the IMF and the World Bank via Zoom, saying that the SLA is pending and should be very, very soon, as well as a political and constitutional crisis that threatens to undo the very social and political fabric of the country. This is the 3rd major report on the economic issues faced by Pakistan by the World Bank in as many months. In February of this year, Tabadlab had the pleasure of also hosting the Country Economic Memorandum Report that was penned by World Bank's Gonzalo Varela and Zera Aslam. That report specifically focused on some of the bottlenecks to economic progress in Pakistan and very specifically looked at productivity, investment, and most crucially, female labor force participation as key drivers of economic change. Last month, the World Bank also had held an event to commemorate its previously launched Country Climate and Development Report for Pakistan, which looks at the nexus of development work and climate change financing in the country and makes the case for why this intersection needs to be rationalized. One of the most shocking statistics for me personally from that report was the fact that between now and 2030, Pakistan needs somewhere around $248 billion to meet its climate financing needs. But both of these reports are available on the World Bank websites, and the links to those will be available in the notes below. But the conversation that we are holding today is about the Public Expenditure Review at the federal level 2023. It is comprised of 5 chapters, as I said, by 4 economists at the World Bank. Please allow me to introduce them now. First, my good friend, Mr. Derek Chen. He is one of the 2 authors who are physically with us here in the Islamabad studios. He oversees the macroeconomic and fiscal program and leads the production of various economic reports. He has been working at the bank for almost 23 years now and has held several positions, including the senior economist for Indonesia and the regional economist for Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, Derek. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
We also have in the studio with us Mr. Adnan Ashraf, another senior economist in the macroeconomics, trade, and investment global practice of the World Bank. His areas of interest include macroeconomic stabilization, fiscal policy analysis, and public debt management. Currently, he is leading World Bank's lending operations both at national and subnational levels, focused on improving fiscal and debt management and fiscal sustainability. Our other 2 authors are joining us from Washington, D.C. So first, I just wanted to say thank you to both of you for being up at the crack of dawn and being with us here today. We have with us Qurat and Hadi, a governance specialist at the World Bank's Governance Global Practice. Qurat has worked on state-owned enterprises reforms and in addressing service delivery bottlenecks to improve expenditure efficiency. She specifically contributes to the 4th chapter, and I'm very interested in the conversation that I'm going to have with you, Qurat. In the past 8 years at the World Bank, Qurat has led, among others, dialogue on SOE fiscal and corporate governance reforms and capacity building initiatives for financial and fiscal discipline for SOEs in Pakistan and at the global level. So welcome, Qurat. Very happy to have you here. And finally, Florian Blum, a senior economist at the World Bank. Florian is in the World Bank's macroeconomics, trade, and investment global practice. An expert on fiscal issues, Florian has worked on expenditure and revenue policy across South Asia for the past 5 years. Some might actually argue that he is an honorary South Asian. Among others, he has worked on fiscal policy reviews in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan. More recently, he has started covering Ukraine as a country economist for the World Bank. Welcome, Florian. Looking forward to having the conversation with you. I also want to flag at this point that while each of the 5 chapters have been put together by an individual author, all 4 of these individuals have contributed to every single chapter. The first focuses on reducing Pakistan's persistent and debilitating fiscal deficits, prepared by Derek Chiang. The second tackles how to move towards an inclusive and productive federal expenditure, prepared by Florian Blum. The third diagnoses and provides solutions for the tremendous debt management crisis that the country currently faces, prepared by Mr. Adnan Ashraf. The fourth is about reducing the fiscal impact of state-owned enterprises, which is prepared by Qurat and Harun. And the fifth and final chapter provides a robust roadmap for enabling a modern and efficient tax system, once again penned by Florian Blum. Let me congratulate all 4 of you, not just for the depth and breadth of this very comprehensive report, but also for how accessible it is and the fact that it takes a very solutions-oriented approach to solve some of these very large-scale problems. Let's start the conversation with Derek, if you'll allow me. If you can give us a short overview of what the Federal Level Public Expenditure Review is. You know, it talks about state-owned enterprises, it talks about an integrated debt management system, it talks about various things across its 5 chapters. But what is the central function of the report, and what is it trying to accomplish?
Thank you, Zishan, and thank you for inviting us here today to talk about our report. So the Public Expenditure Review is actually a report that we produce for many countries. As we mentioned, the last one that was done at the federal level for Pakistan was back in 2010. And since then, we had 3 reports done at the provincial level. We had one in KP in 2012, another one for Punjab in 2013, and in 2017, we had one from Punjab. So for this one, we are actually focusing at the federal level, and report actually, in broadest terms, explores the drivers for Pakistan's fiscal deficits and tries to give policy recommendations for how Pakistan can regain fiscal and debt sustainability. So in the matter words, it focuses more on the structural factors. It looks at the reasons for Pakistan's deficit over the longer term, and it's not so much a report on austerity measures, which the government is looking at this point in time. That being said, the report builds upon previous studies, many of which have been done. It gives new and updated data, and then again tries to give recommendations for reducing the fiscal deficit, which is what the country is looking at this point in time. We hope that the way the report is structured, as Azizan has mentioned, it focuses on expenditures as well as revenue. I'd like to highlight that chapters 3 and 4 on debt management and SOEs actually dwell on large key components of fiscal expenditures. Interest payments, as many people know, accounts for 1/3 of federal fiscal expenditures. That's like 4.7% of GDP in FY22. Largely, and similarly, fiscal support to SOE accounts to 1.4% of GDP in FY22. So these are huge chunks of fiscal expenditures which want to dive in to see how can we reduce the amount that's being spent or spend it in a better way. Lastly, just to say that we think that this report is being released at a very timely situation given the fiscal situation that the country is facing. We hope that the federal government can consider the numerous policy recommendations in the report. All of them were based on evidence. They're empirically based policy recommendations, and we hope that the government can seriously consider these policy recommendations as it goes ahead and formulates the budget for next year. At the same time, another way we hope this report can contribute to Pakistan. It can enhance the level of policy dialogue as well as the discussions, enrich the discussions that you are hosting, many of them, and that's going all around the country, so that it can help Pakistan regain its fiscal and debt sustainability, as well as steer the economy back towards macroeconomic stability. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Derek, for giving us that brief but very, very comprehensive overview. And I think you're right, as I mentioned in my opening remarks as well. This is a crucial time for Pakistan to be very carefully studying and looking at these policy recommendations. I also want to mention at this point that the World Bank has been working very closely with the government of Pakistan to ensure that all of the policy recommendations in this report actually make sense and are implementable given the right political will as well as impetus from the powers that be. Derek, I have just a couple of other quick questions for you, if you'll allow me. The formula, generally speaking, seems very simple. Reduce your expenditures, increase your revenue, create some kind of mechanism against macroeconomic volatility. But it seems like, even though the formula seems very simple, Pakistan always seems to have trouble in these areas. And we seem to be in this consistent downward spiral where the national consolidated budget balance has barely risen above -5% of GDP in the last 12 fiscal years. Can you walk us through why this is and what can be done against it?
So in terms of, yes, Zishan, that's absolutely very true. Pakistan's overall fiscal deficit actually was larger than 4% for the past 15 years. And in fiscal year 2022, it reached a 22-year high of 7.9% of GDP. So yes, Pakistan's deficit is high and quite persistent. And what we actually show that if you take the average of the fiscal deficit before and after 2010, which is when the 18th Amendment happened, the fiscal deficits in the new era is actually 50% larger than what it was prior to 2010. So it's persistent, it's large, and it's growing as well. Now, with regard to why it's persistent, there are a few factors highlighted in the report. The first one deals with the rigidity of fiscal expenditures combined with the low revenue collection. And I believe my colleagues will dive into that, so I'll skip that for now. Another one, as we have all alluded to, it's the fiscal architecture. So with the 18th Amendment, we know that like 17 subject areas were actually devolved to the provinces. But when you look at the structure of the federal government today, we see many of these ministries actually still exist, and they're spending a significant amount of resources. What we saw in fiscal year 22 was that these ministries, the spending of these ministries on devolved subject amounted to 328 billion rupees, or roughly equivalent to 0.5% of GDP in FY22. So this, we think, if the devolvement was complete, could be a potential area for fiscal savings. A second thing is that we notice with the fiscal architecture is what we call fiscal asymmetry or vertical asymmetry. With the devolvement of subject areas to the provinces, the large chunk of tax revenue was actually given to the provinces for them to carry out or to implement these devolved subject areas. So the federal government actually retains a minority share of tax revenue. But at the same time, when you look at the structure of national expenditures, the federal government is still shouldering 2/3 of this fiscal expenditures. So in that sense, they're keeping less revenues but have to spend more. So there is a tendency for the federal government to run a fiscal deficit. So this we identify as another source of persistence of the fiscal deficit. Another thing is that we see that the institutions for fiscal policy making in Pakistan is quite complex, and there are many players. For example, we were counting the other day how many institutions are actually involved in national policy making. We have 3 at the federal level, 5 in each province. That actually works out to be 23 agencies or institutions involved in national fiscal policy making. That's a lot of institutions where we need to get coordinated an agreement on what is a sustainable path of fiscal deficit. So we think that this, and other examples that we have in debt making and how the tax base is fragmented, overall these, the architecture is complicated, and if we can improve that, that will be a significant way of reducing fiscal deficits. Last but not least is some non-budgetary factors. For example, macroeconomic factors like the depreciation exchange rate can actually drive up the amount of debt. The debt is valued in rupee terms. So when the rupee depreciates against the US dollars, and 1/3 of Pakistan's public debt is actually denominated in US dollars. So when the depreciation happens, the value of Pakistan's public debt in rupees actually goes up. And we find that in the most recent years, exchange rate depreciation contributes more to the debt than the primary deficit. So things like that, where we can reduce macroeconomic volatility, would help to smoothen the jumps in debt and help to mitigate any jumps in public debt.
Right. Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
That is a very comprehensive summary of everything that is contained within the report. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, which specifically has to do with macroeconomic volatility and the fact that the depreciation of the money and the fluctuation in the market is actually adding more to the debt than the servicing itself. One of the questions that I asked another economist friend of mine was, why is it that Pakistan does not have any hedging mechanisms against macroeconomic volatility, when several other countries, several within our own category, actually have those? But perhaps that's a conversation for another time. I'll switch on over to Qurat and Hadi. I apologize, Qurat and Hadi. I believe earlier I may have called you Harun, but that's because I have a friend called Qurat and Harun, and maybe I just missed her in the middle of the conversation. Your chapter I was very interested in because it focuses on state-owned enterprises. And I think one of the most shocking statistics in the report, which I found in your chapter, was that the biggest loss-generating SOE in Pakistan is not the airlines, it's not railway, it's not steel mills, it actually happens to be the National Highway Authority, which was a shocking turn of events for me. I wouldn't have picked that as the top state-owned enterprise that would be generating losses at this point. They, of course, represent a very significant fiscal risk for the federal government. And I guess my question to you is, can you give us a sense of the SOE landscape in Pakistan and also the magnitude of the fiscal impact that loss-making SOEs have on the GDP?
Thank you, Zishan, and thank you very much for highlighting on NHA, which I'll come towards the end of our discussion on this. But to address your direct question here is, the landscape of SOEs is, the federal SOEs is large. Like I would say that there are total 207 SOEs. 179 are public sector companies, which includes 87 commercial SOEs. Another 21 SOEs have been created by special enactments, and the remaining 7 are foreign incorporated subsidiaries. They employ nearly 500,000 people, and the federal SOEs are largely active in the strategic and commercial sectors, including manufacturing, trade, and services, and some operate as national monopolies. The commercial SOEs portfolio in Pakistan has an asset base of almost PKR 23 trillion, which approximate 48% of the GDP. And this is like just the commercial SOEs, which are 87 in a number. The aggregate profitability of the federal commercial SOEs has deteriorated since financial year 2014. Direct financial support to SOEs account for 1.4% of GDP. And when I say direct support, it means the domestic and foreign loans, grants, and subsidies, and which also accounts for 18% of the federal deficit in financial year 2022. And just to remind you that the financial year 2022 is where we have the highest fiscal deficit. SOE fiscal exposure, including guarantees, accounts for 9.7% of the GDP in financial year 2021. However, consolidated footprint of SOEs at national level cannot be determined because of not having a comprehensive database at provincial level, which is not the subject of the federal PER, but we will allude it more into the policy notes that we will share with the government. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Qurat. I guess an immediate question, I'm not an expert, but one of the questions that immediately comes to mind for me personally is, if we were to look at state-owned enterprises that were generating profits and revenue and compare and contrast them against state-owned enterprises that were making losses, are there any learning lessons that can be directly translated from one to the other? Or do we need to entirely change the approach and the manner in which we do things?
So, Zishan, there are very interesting statistics. When we look into the data, we find out very interesting facts about it, that the profit and losses of the federal SOEs are concentrated among a few enterprises. Though we didn't do the comprehensive assessment on the factors that leads to the profit and losses of those SOEs, but what we have done is we looked into the key factors that is driving the profit in the profit-making SOEs and the losses for the losses-making SOEs. So as I mentioned, that the profit and losses of the federal SOEs are concentrated among a few enterprises. The significant profit-making SOEs comprise 5 companies, which together constitute 70% of the total combined profit of profit-making SOEs. Similarly, the large loss-making SOEs consist of only 7 companies, which together account for 84% of the combined total losses of the loss-making SOEs. So the loss-making SOEs are mainly concentrated in the power and transport sector. And in the transport sector, it includes rails, highways, railways, and aviation subsectors. The profit-making SOEs are largely into the oil and gas sector. So when we analyze what are the major factors of the profits, we realize that those profit-making sectors have low customer base because they are largely OGDCL. One can debate that SNGPL has a larger database, but then those profitable SOEs are also facing liquidity challenges due to large receivables balance owed by other poor performing SOEs. And these intra-SOE debts can create an implicit government obligations, particularly when there is insufficient liquidity with the government to settle such accounts. The lessons, the common factor that we have seen, and we cannot say that this is 100% attributable to it, because there are certain sectoral reforms that's coming in each profit and loss making category, but mostly the profit making SOEs are listed companies in the stock exchange. So one factor that can contribute in the profitability is more discipline, more financial and fiscal discipline, more accountability, and more, I would not say that the regulatory requirements would make them, but the sense of accountability of the shareholders' money is definitely something which is making them to perform better. So this is one of the categorically a common factor in all the profit-making SOEs, I would say. The loss-making SOEs, the accumulated losses from the federal commercial SOEs has been substantial, and it's largely coming from the transport and infrastructure sector, as you have mentioned. There are various factors that are contributing to these loss-making SOEs, and the power sector is another area where these losses are coming from. So one of the factors in the loss-making SOEs, what we have found is that incomplete reforms that they were there. The reforms, the corporate governance reforms, largely these loss-making SOEs are the DISCOs, some of the GENCOs, and the PIA, railways, and NHA. And those sectoral reforms have not produced something that can translate into the role of regulator, I would say, and the accountability, sense of accountability, because whenever they are incurring losses, that has been provided, that has been supported by the government supports them through the direct support in the form of grants, in the form of subsidies for their unfunded public service obligations. So those are actually, providing. They know that they have, in the case of loss, there is some support coming from the government, which is not incentivizing them to perform better. So the sense of accountability, the sense of the oversight institutions, the performance of the oversight institutions in case of loss-making SOE is not that strong. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yep. So involving the stakeholders, the shareholders, accountability, finishing the process of sectoral reforms that we started, all of these are great ideas. If you'll allow me for just one more second, Qurat, I guess the dual carriage that we seem to not be able to operate simultaneously is how is it that the government can operate these SOEs efficiently and effectively while at the same time ensuring that growth and economic development is not hampered? And I think you've sufficiently answered that in some regards, but I just wanted to give you space to make sure that if there's any specific strategies that you had in mind that are covered, especially in the report, that we talk about some of those here.
Yeah, so in terms of, we have provided a list of recommendations for the short-term and long-term reforms that go, like certain short-term steps that the government can take immediately to address these, to reduce the fiscal impact of SOEs in Pakistan. And those includes, like in terms of government's fiscal consolidation efforts, the federal government should need to minimize its long outstanding practice of covering the operating losses of SOEs, which I just mentioned. And how it can be done by different approaches, for example, instituting strict conditionalities and performance governance for issuance of new fiscal support to SOEs. It can be done by considering debt equity swap for state-owned enterprises that undertake quasi-fiscal activities. And the most important one would be enforcing the loan contracts, the own lending terms that the government has with those SOEs need to be strictly adhered to, because like the numbers were really shocking for us when we come to know that almost 30% of the outstanding loan of the domestic outstanding loan relates to the overdue principal and interest amounts that these SOEs has to pay back to the government. In terms of one is the direct support that the government is providing through loans and subsidies and grants, but there is much more that the government is doing because of its liquidity crunch, that the support that government is providing to these SOEs through the guarantees. And the growing risk coming from these guarantees is not yet calculated. It cannot be quantified. If we just look into the fiscal exposure that the government has towards outstanding loans and guarantees together becomes 9.7, almost 10% of the GDP. So, these guarantees have an impact in terms of, those guarantees are providing the SOEs to go for the commercial borrowing. And that commercial borrowing is then, like, in a way, crowding out the space for the private sector, crowding out the private sector growth. So in terms of how we can address to the guarantees, how we can minimize the risk coming from the guarantees is to enforce the overall guaranteed limit based on the legislative amendments. And there has been certain legislative amendments in the recent past, and link the outstanding loans and guarantees to the size of the SOEs. The government should introduce a maximum cap on exposure based on the best practices as a percentage of SOEs liabilities and asset, because generally there is no cap in terms of individual SOEs. It's just an overall cap that has been provided through the law. One very important thing which government has already initiated is to prepare the aggregate reports on the federal SOEs, which could be a very effective tool for decision making. But unfortunately, the preparation of those aggregate reports are not timely. And the comprehensive of these reports can also be improved by following OECD guidelines. So right. Those are like the very like short-term easy steps, low-hanging fruits that the government can take And in terms of longer term arrangements, the government has a reform plan in terms of triage that they have that has been produced by the government. And the triage is actually laying down the foundation of laying down the government's plan of improving the state-owned enterprises. So the implementation of triage is something very important that the government should start as soon as possible. Thank you.
I think that is just a highlight of the depth and breadth and the robustness of the policy recommendations that are contained within this report. And they exist at the end of every single one of the 5 chapters. And my wish and pray, as part and parcel of this, a series of efforts that Tabadlab is putting together for the this particular report, is that policymakers, decision makers, and lawmakers actually take the time to sort of deep dive into these reports and try to see which one of these policy recommendations can be implemented into at least the short to medium term, if not the long term. Florian, I'll switch over to you for the second chapter for now. I'll then go to Adnan, and then I'll come back to every Pakistani's favorite subject, which is tax. But I think we'll start first with the second chapter. Very simple question to start off with, which is, what does it mean that the federal government spending is rigid and that's a bad thing for the country?
Yeah, thanks Seshan, and thanks for having us. Let me take a step back, maybe, to answer this question and ask, what is the purpose of government spending, and what does it intend to do in an economy? And I think there's 2 ways to classify government spending. One reason for government spending is that the government needs to keep the administration running, so pay for interest payments, pay for salaries for public employees. That's spending that's a necessity, but that doesn't generate a growth dividend. And then there's spending, like development spending, like investments in human capital and people, that generates a growth dividend and that helps the country grow in the long run. And typically, as economists, we suggest that the second type of spending should be financed with debt, and the first spending should be financed out of revenue. The second part can be financed with debt because you borrow, but then you generate a growth dividend that will give you more return in the future to pay back. Now, when we look at Pakistan, we realize that 80% of total spending actually accrues to the former category. So the administrative, rigid spending that is pre-committed. So pensions, salaries, goods and services, expenditures of the government, interest payments. And Pakistan finances a lot of that spending with debt. So it borrows to finance things that don't necessarily generate a growth dividend in the future. And that puts it into a sort of vicious circle, because it borrows, and as a result, it has a higher debt load in the future, it gets higher interest payments, which means that it again needs to borrow more in the future, and sort of continually this circle continues, and expenditure on those rigid areas keeps going up. There's a couple of factors that compound this. One of them is, as Derek mentioned earlier, that borrowing happens in a way that the debt stock is subject to shocks, because Pakistan borrows short-term loans or at flexible interest rates. So when the macro conditions change, interest rates go up, and the country has to spend even more on interest payments. And as a result, the rigidity continues going up. So it's really a vicious circle that's sort of self-reinforcing. What we show in the report is that this doesn't just stand by itself, but that there's actually a trade-off between that productive development spending that helps the economy develop and grow, and that rigid spending. So what we show is that when interest spending goes up for exogenous reasons, development spending gets crowded out. So the government has to spend more on interest payments, it prioritizes those interest payments, and then it doesn't have any financing or funding left to pay for development spending, to pay for human capital, so that goes down. And that, of course, hinders the development of the country. And so what we argue in the report is that we need to think about an overhaul of the fiscal system, where the rigid administrative spending gets realigned with the revenue potential, so it gets cut together, and at the same time the revenue potential gets increased, so that you actually do have more space to cover the outstanding interest payments. What I want to mention now, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more in our further conversation, is that there are no silver bullets to achieve this. So someone has to make a hard choice about what kind of spending to prioritize and how to get there. Let me stop here.
Absolutely, Florian. To your point, I also do want to mention that this is not the only conversation that Tabadlab is going to be hosting on this particular topic. We have a series of conversations that we're going to have. In fact, one that is scheduled for the week of April 24th between yourself, Derek, and the host of our Pakistani podcast, Mr. Uzair Yunus, which is going to focus a little bit more on the chapters that the two of you have put together and get a little bit deeper into that conversation. But everything that you've said so far, I mean, I guess the closest analogy to it would be if you're running a house. Once you get your salary, you have to take out the fixed costs. You can't really do any kind of financial planning unless you've accounted for your rent, for your utilities, for your phone bill, any salaries you have to pay. You have to take all of that money out. And the problem in Pakistan at the moment is that once you take that money out, specifically in terms of pensions, in terms of salaries, in terms of debt servicing, there's a very tiny slice of the pie left, which begs the very obvious next question. Where do we generate fiscal savings from at the federal level? How do we actually go about doing this? Particularly, Florian, in the short to medium term, because our short-term survivability is in question at the moment.
Yeah, totally. Let me just go back to your previous point. I couldn't agree more. I think there's a nice analogy in the US between credit card interest rate and mortgage interest rate, right? Credit card interest rate, if you borrow on a credit card to finance your food expenditure on a day-to-day, that doesn't generate any assets for you, and that puts you in a downward spiral. In terms of saving areas, I think we point out a lot in the report, but I want to focus on two areas here specifically. And one area is the one that Derek already teased earlier in his introduction, which is on what we call constitutional alignment with expenditure responsibilities. So after the 18th Amendment, the federal government has really started devolving a lot of its revenue base to the provinces. And then one obvious question is, if you give this much money to the provinces, do you also devolve as much expenditure responsibilities? Do you actually spend less to make sure that your deficit stays in check? And so we looked at 3 types of spending categories to see if that's the case. Here's what we found. So first we looked at the devolved ministries, so those 17 ministries that are in devolved subject areas, and looked at whether their spending had been reduced. And really, to our surprise, we found that, quite the contrary, spending has gone up by 0.1 percentage point of GDP between 2009 and 2022. So the devolved ministries today, as a share of GDP, spend more than they did before the 18th Amendment. So there's already a clear visibility that there's a bit of a mismatch there. So what we recommend is that the authorities take a very close look, maybe define some terms of references for these ministries to really find ways to drill them down to their federal function, the constitutionally assigned federal function, and use that to generate saving possibilities. The second area that we looked at is federal programs such as the BISP Social Protection Program or the Higher Education Commission. So federal programs that work very well, but that are sort of in an overlap or in an area of provincial responsibility. And there we also found that the federal government does continue to finance these. It's a very significant expenditure source, whereas the province's contribution to funding them is relatively minor. So our recommendation there is to speak with the provinces to be a bit pragmatic and say, look, we have those programs that work very well, but with our current financing envelope, it's not feasible to finance them alone, so we need to come to an agreement. And then the third area we looked at is the public sector development program. So what in other countries we call capital spending, in Pakistan we call development spending. And there we found that about 0.5% of GDP of the federal level development expenditure is actually in areas that are the responsibility of provincial governments. So that's another area to generate some savings. And then a big second pot that we look at in the report is subsidies. Qurat already sort of alluded to this on the SOE side. For instance, electricity subsidies account for about a quarter of a percentage of GDP, 0.25% of GDP. And those electricity subsidies come from a good place. The idea is that you protect the poor and make sure that electricity remains affordable for everybody. The problem is that those subsidies are not a great tool to achieve this because they generate spillovers. So if you subsidize electricity for the poor, the rich will also take advantage of it. They generate incentives to consume energy that in many cases generates pollution or carbon emissions. So there are better ways to design them and in a more cost-effective manner. And that can, for instance, be done by identifying protected consumer groups or by aligning the tariff schedule with costs and identifying targeted fiscal transfers to the poor to help them cover the utility costs. So that's the second area that we suggest. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Florian. And everything that you've said so far, I think, sits right with the team that is working at Tabadlab, and actually intersects quite nicely with some of the other work that we're also pursuing. For instance, we have just began this endeavor that looks at the intersection between climate vulnerability and debt vulnerability. And from everything that I can tell from the spring meetings in the IMF and the World Bank in DC at the moment, a good chunk of that conversation seems to be dominated by debt forgiveness and debt vulnerability, because it seems like a lot of countries around the world are really suffering from being unable to meet their debt servicing needs every quarter, going on quarter. And with every successive quarter, the situation seems to be exacerbating further and further. And Pakistan, of course, very much serves as the poster child for now this global trend. Florian, if you'll allow me, I'll come back to you again, as I said, for our favorite topic, which is taxes. But I'll switch over to Adnan very briefly for now. Adnan, the chapter that you have put together, Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio does not seem that high compared to what we would call peer or comparative countries, right? But then why are there questions about Pakistan's debt sustainability? And in your view, where do these risks emanate from? And when you talk about these risks in the report, what are some of the solutions and what are some of the ways that these risks can then be sort of managed and mitigated?
Thank you very much, Zishan, for hosting us. And so far, I think the conversation has been very productive. So focusing on this specific question, I think it's absolutely right perception that Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio is not as high when compared with the other global economies of the similar size or the peer countries. So for instance, Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio at the end of fiscal year 22 was 78% of GDP. But when we compare it with the countries which are going through debt restructuring at the moment, for example, Sri Lanka, which has 128% of GDP, and Ghana, which is slightly above 100% of GDP, it does seem that Pakistan is at a relatively comfortable position. But where do the risks to Pakistan's debt actually emanate? And that's a question which I think in part has been answered by Derek, Florian and Qurat, and that actually has to do with the sizable deficits that Pakistan runs, and which actually then transfer into sizable financing needs. But at the same time, one has to look at the maturity profile of Pakistan's public debt, which is a big chunk of it is maturing in the next 1 to 5 years. So if we go into the specifics of it, so I think on the first part there has been a lot of conversation, but one point I would like to mention on fiscal deficits is that the fiscal deficits are not only a source of driving up the debt, but they are also a source of driving up the macro volatility in the country, which is a direct input into the fluctuations that we see in the exchange rate and fluctuations that we see in the interest rate, which I think were picked up in the conversation before. But what then happens is that if we look at the composition of our public debt, 60% of it is domestic, which is in PKR, and 40% of it is is in foreign currency. Now, when we come to the domestic debt, again, we look at the maturity profile, and a big chunk of it matures in 1 to 3 years. And I think that is one area where the risks are emanating from. And when you look at the fact that inflation is going up, and with that interest rates are going up, and of course fiscal is a contributory factor to that, of course the cost does add up as well. And when we go to the external part, again on the external side, while a large chunk of Pakistan's debt still remains a multilateral concessional financing, there's a portion which is maturing in next 1 to 5 years, which is adding to the financing pressures. Now, there's a very particular thing about the Pakistan's borrowing mix. As Pakistan faces financing pressures due to the fiscal persistent deficits and due to the fact of the global conditions where Pakistan is not able to access global capital markets with the same frequency as it was doing perhaps in recent past, what is happening is that more and more pressure is coming to the domestic side. And we do see that on the domestic side, cost is going up, and that again is adding up to the pressure. Now coming to the solution again, the long-term solution lies in controlling the fiscal deficit. So I won't focus that much on that point. But the second point is that the maturity profile of Pakistan's public debt, which is very much skewed towards short to medium term, that has to be managed in a better way. And I think in this regard, there are a few things that need to happen. The first thing that must happen is that Pakistan should stay in the IMF program, because a big chunk of this maturity comes from the external loans, and as of today, Pakistan's reserves are not adequate enough to entertain some of these maturing loans. So Pakistan must stay in the IMF program to get the needed financing, also refinance some of the loans which are maturing with the help of the IMF program, and then of course get fresh financing which can help mitigate some of these arising maturities. But at the same time, it's equally important that as the fiscal position improves, Pakistan starts to focus on lengthening the maturity profile of the domestic debt. And this is where I think long-term reform is very much important, because lengthening the maturity profile of Pakistan's domestic debt is not going to be easy without a well-structured capital markets program in Pakistan. So as of today, we do see that Pakistan's prime borrowing source, domestic borrowing source, is the domestic banking sector, which is not only leading to the crowding out of the private sector, because banks are lending a big chunk of their loanable funds to the government, but at the same time, they are doing it at a very short maturity. So I think that in itself is a huge reform agenda, which needs, of course, macroeconomic stability in the country. But in parallel, Pakistan does have to take a move towards this initiative. I'll stop here. If there are any follow-ups, I'm happy to answer.
I absolutely have follow-ups, because this is probably one of the most complex parts of the report. In fact, my follow-up question to you would be regarding the roadblocks. So as far as having a comprehensive and integrated debt management strategy is concerned, what are some of the ways that that we can facilitate that? And one of the things that, for example, I learned recently is that there is a position at the ministry known as DG debt. And if that position is sufficient to manage the scale of the problem that Pakistan faces, especially considering the downward spiral and the boom and bust cycle that used to be 4 years, but I would argue is maybe 4 months now.
Now, Zishan, I think this is a very important question. So far, maybe the conversation has focused more on the fiscal deficit and debt relationship, because that is where primarily the debt is arising from. But equally important is the question that how Pakistan can better manage debt at a portfolio level. And I think in this regard, debt management is a very, very important part of this solution. So I think coming to the first part of the question, the debt strategy is perhaps to enlighten the audience is simply a framework which helps the governments to basically execute their borrowing decisions and their borrowing operations in line with the macroeconomic conditions in the country, the market conditions, and the external environment. What we do see in Pakistan is that the debt management has not been anchored in a structured debt management strategy, and part of this issue has to do with the reason that debt management has been fragmented in Pakistan. So if we look at the institutional setup of debt management in Pakistan, legally the finance secretary under the constitution of Pakistan is delegated the power to borrow on behalf of government of Pakistan. But if we look practically how it is being executed, there are various entities which are involved in this conversation. So for example, Ministry of Finance is one part, Economic Affairs Division is another part, State Bank of Pakistan is another part. Now when there is so much fragmentation, of course there is suboptimal choices that are made. And we did the analysis in this report that how those suboptimal choices are impacting the cost and the outcome. And the conservative estimate is that between fiscal year 20 and 22, Pakistan approximately paid 0.5% of GDP above what it could have saved. And I think Florian alluded to that in the initial part of the conversation, the point of fixed versus floating rate borrowing. So I think the way forward is to consolidate, and one must commend the government of Pakistan here that because they've done some reforms recently, that they have established a unified debt management office in the Ministry of Finance under the Finance Secretary. They've done the legal amendment for that, and that is where the DG debt position is, as Zishan you were mentioning, alluding to. But the point is that this reform needs a more kind of like nurturing. And one thing that can definitely support it is the fact that the legal mandate is there. Now the debt office needs the human resource, which is trained and equipped to tackle the complex debt portfolio of Pakistan and make prudent decisions, but at the same time the debt office needs the operational independence to do day-to-day borrowing operations. I think if that happens, we can definitely see a lot of cost saving coming from the fact that Pakistan is executing its borrowing plans in a much better and coherent way under a debt strategy, which is very much linked with Pakistan's macro fiscal realities. So for instance, we are at a time now in Pakistan where macro pressures are high, fiscal deficit is high, interest rates are high, so maybe right now there is very little room to move around at this point in time. But definitely as the fiscal space improves, the macro also improves, there is a lot of space, and this also links to the first question that you asked me, that Pakistan should move to long-term domestic borrowing, which get rid of the exchange rate risk, which get rid of the interest rate risk that we see. So I think that's a probable way forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Adnan. And once again, I would encourage those that are watching this particular feed to look at the notes below, download the report, and really look at the depth of these recommendations, particularly at the end of Adnan's chapter, to see some of the ways in which we can have this very structured and integrated debt management system in Pakistan, which is very much the need of the hour, considering this is an area that where we suffer the most. Florian, before I come back to you with the final chapter, which is on tax, Qurat, if I may just do a follow-up question. When we spoke about the SOEs, we spoke about the National Highway Authority, and I guess my question to you is, what are some of the factors that are contributing towards losses in the NHA? If I remember the number correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the percentage was 0.36. And what are some of the mitigation strategies to turn this loss-making SOE into a profit-generating SOE?
Thank you, Zishan. Yeah, so NHA is a very special case. Like as you mentioned, NHA has the highest fiscal exposure among all SOEs, which accounts for over 75% of the total outstanding loan, equivalent to 2.6% of the GDP. And you rightly said that the loss coming from NHA is around 0.4% of GDP in financial year 20. One of the contributing factor to this is that the government considers the NHA as an operational arm for implementing road and highway infrastructure projects, which in many cases undertakes development projects based on national priorities rather than economic feasibility. And an example to this is the recent flood, where the NHA has undertaken sizable reconstruction of the roads and highways in the province of Sindh, Balochistan, and KP. So the NHA's profitability is largely impacted by high debt service cost on the foreign relent and government development funds, which are treated as loans and liabilities by NHA in the government and NHA financial statement. The NHA is not able to pay its development, to finance the development projects from its own resources, neither has sufficient funds to repay its loans. So MOF is very cognizant of the fact, and they are very much looking into improving its operational performance, which in the report we are mentioning that this can be done by implementing good management practices to generate profit, such as development of business plan, costing of public service obligation, and revisiting policies related to domestic loan and foreign relent loans, along with the prudent financial management practices and improve accountability in NHA. I hope I have answered your question now.
No, that's great. Thank you, Qurat. And from everything that you've said, it seems to me that the NHA is a very special case simply by virtue of the fact that by nature of its operations, it prioritizes national needs over profitability, and that is certainly a factor that we should consider when we look at the numbers coming from the NHA. So thank you for that clarification. And finally, Florian, coming to you with the tax questions for chapter number 5. And I'll start off with, how can Pakistan improve sales tax? Is that even a good idea? Is that something that Pakistan should actually even pursue? My personal preference, of course, would be no, but I also recognize and I'm cognizant of the fact that there's nothing but pain for most of my fellow Pakistanis in the coming months, be it in the form of short-sighted and short-term decisions, or preparing for the long-term overhaul and reform agenda that this country desperately needs.
Yeah, thanks, Seshan, and thanks for asking about sales tax, because that's, at least on a theoretical level, a fantastic tax. So a sales tax is or as the rest of the world calls it, a value-added tax, has a lot of advantages if it's done right. It's economically efficient, so it doesn't induce firms to produce inefficiently. It's what we call self-enforcing, so it's a tax that manages to generate revenue without too much administration needed to make sure that everyone pays it. And it's really just, in an economy like Pakistan that's import dependent, it can be a big revenue generator at a minimum cost. So as economists, public finance economists that want to help the government finance its deficit or its expenditure, that's typically what we look for in a tax, something that's sufficient to generate revenue to meet the expenditures, but that doesn't generate too much downsides on the other side. So that's the sort of theoretical perspective. The challenge in Pakistan is that for the sales tax to work in this way, it needs to be designed efficiently. That means it needs to cover a broad base. It needs to cover as much of the domestic consumption and transactions as possible. So basically cover a lot of the economy. And in Pakistan, there are 3 reasons why that's not the case. The first one is that there are many exemptions. So a lot of transactions are actually exempt from the sales tax. And those exemptions don't only reduce the revenue, they also generate sort of shifts along the value chain. So if I'm a producer and I buy something from an exempt input provider, then I cannot claim sales tax credit on this, and that means my production costs go up. So there are both fiscal and economic implications of those exemptions. Then there are lots of concessional rates, so there are lower rates on the sales tax. And then there are also what we call zero ratings. So that's getting a bit technical, but there are many reasons why the Pakistan sales tax system has really sort of reduced the base. And at the same time, the sales tax rate is comparatively high in international comparison. So what Pakistan does is it taxes a small base with a high rate. And our recommendation in the report is to turn this around and to say, look, let's define a roadmap where we can broaden the base, cover as much of the economy as possible to make sure that Pakistan can really take full advantage of those benefits that the sales tax has to offer. And that, generates additional revenue that may even give leeway to lower the rate a little bit to provide relief. So making it a more fair, a more economically efficient, and more equally distributed tax with a broader base. Let me stop here.
Great, thank you, Florian. So it seems to me like what Pakistan is currently doing is not necessarily working. For as long as I can remember, one of the conversations that we keep having in this country is the widening and the increasing of the tax net, and avoiding doing this, going through this entire process where those that are already inside the tax net are continue to be squeezed more instead of sort of widening that net itself and having and doing away with some of these exemptions, some of these concessional rates, which then begs my final and follow-up question, and that is, if we were to then look at international benchmarks and see what some of these peer and comparative countries have done, what are the key learning lessons that can be deployed, especially the ones that have been included in this report?
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, the sales tax I just alluded to, so let me talk about 2 other taxes that I think offer some insights that Pakistan can learn from. One of them is tobacco excise, so excise duty on cigarette consumption. Mm-hmm. That's a tax that public finance economists typically prefer because it doesn't only generate revenue, it also has positive health effects. It provides an incentive for people to stop smoking or think a bit harder about what the health implications of smoking are. So when we started looking at this, we realized that Pakistan's revenue collection from this is relatively low, especially when you compare it with numbers in household surveys that show how many people actually smoke. So then we were thinking, what is one of the challenges here? We started looking around and realized that the design of the tax is actually very comparable to international benchmarks. But then when you look at actual cigarette packages, it seems like none of them have that little mark on it that shows that the tax has actually been paid. So here, the discussion in the report really focuses on what can Pakistan learn from international experience on enforcement issues. So how do other countries enforce cigarette taxation? And there's two avenues that the report suggests. One is to leverage technology. So, for instance, you can think about printing QR codes on cigarette packages, and that QR code links to a tax revenue database that makes sure that that specific pack of cigarettes actually had its tax paid on it. And you can also think about providing incentives for people that find cigarettes somewhere in the market where the tax had not been paid and report it to have them share some of the resulting revenue. So that's one area. I think we're getting a bit creative with enforcement on cigarette taxation. I think is one area where Pakistan can learn from international experience. The second one is on personal income taxation. So personal income taxation is a tax that's widely accepted around the world to work for salaried individuals. So for people who have a regular job, who receive a monthly salary, and that salary, you can take the tax directly out of that salary. So in Pakistan, we looked at the schedule and how it's distributed, and we realized, just as one example, that the top rate, that I think it's 35%, but don't quote me on this, is that the threshold for the top rate is extremely high, especially when you compare it to regional peers. So it's, I think, 12 million rupees, at least that was at the time of report writing. And then if you look at, say, India, Nepal, or Bangladesh, that's the equivalent of 3 to 4.5 million rupees. So it's about a third of what Pakistan has as a threshold. So it really is, again, as we talked about earlier, the design of a net that leaves many people outside of the tax net. So broadening the base here is really a task of aligning the schedule much more with the actual income structure. Just a little anecdote on this: we tried to look at it in the household survey, and we actually couldn't find very many people that had such high of an income in the household survey, so we couldn't do any calculations with this. It's another illustration that top rate is chosen to be set very high. Let me stop here.
Well, I would say, Florian, that I think that sounds like there's an entire study there that then could be conducted just in order to determine the data points and draw out conclusions from there. We've discussed all 5 of the chapters. We've had some level of conversation with all 4 of the authors. A lot has been said. I think a lot more needs to be said. As I've mentioned multiple times before, this is just the first of many engagements that Tabadlab is going to be involved in with the World Bank as we try to facilitate these conversations and promote the tremendous work that these 4 economists have put together in the PER. And what I think is truly remarkable for me in this report is not just how accessible it is or how solutions oriented it is, but the fact that it's written in a manner that this conversation can be had by anyone, not necessarily somebody who falls within the economic expertise domain, but by ordinary citizens. And I think that's perhaps one of the most important things coming out of this report, that this really needs to be sort of this national level conversation and not sort of gate kept to this small community that looks at economic issues. And the government really needs to be more invested in not just reading and absorbing and understanding the policy recommendations that come out of this report, but actively engage with this report. Derek and I were having this conversation last night. Derek, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I forget the name of the country in which the other public expenditure report was launched. Which country was that again?
Thailand?
Thailand, right, that one. Where once the report was launched, the government was so impressed by everything that was contained within that report that an infomercial about that report was run on state television screens for an extended length of time, completely free of cost, to ensure that it became a part of the national economic discourse. And I wish and hope and pray to God that those decision makers in Pakistan take sort of a similar route, take this report very, very seriously, and look at it in the manner that we need to. And of course, I say all of this with cognizance of the fact that the spring meetings are going on right now. We have our economic and finance secretaries along the state bank governor presently in DC having these conversations. So it's a very, very timely intervention by the World Bank to come out with this report, particularly considering that at the end of June, we will have the last budget cycle for the outgoing government in Pakistan. And that is also going to determine how the economic situation in the country unfolds in the many months to come. The bottom line, I guess, here is, for me at least, that I wish our policymakers and lawmakers and decision makers, would read and digest and, like I said, act upon the incredible recommendations on this report instead of, tweeting political mudslinging and vitriol. But that is perhaps a conversation for another time. Right now, I just want to give a very sincere thanks to the 4 authors who have done tremendous work in putting this together, and also for sparing their time today to have this conversation with Tabadlab and really sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of what this report contains. Derek Chiang, Adnan, Ashraf, Florian, Blum, and Qurat and Hadi. Thank you very much for being here. As I've said multiple times before, subsequent conversations hosted by Tabadlab, including an upcoming Pakistani episode, will dive deeper into each one of these chapters. Watch this space for those upcoming conversations. They will be uploaded across all of our social media handles. You can find the Public Expenditure Review Report on the World Bank website, the links to which will be in the description below. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Zishan Salahuddin, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you, and Khuda Hafiz.